Okay, Ian. Okay, and I'll just make a note. Ian sent me a note saying that the Q&A is also being recorded. I had shared that information earlier. So welcome to the third book contributors panel of the day. This one is entitled Diverse Cultural Perspectives and Meditative Inquiry. Our first panelist is Dr. Susie Brigham. Dr. Brigham is full professor in the Faculty of Education at Mount St. Vincent University. Her research interests include adult and higher education, immigration, diversity, and gender. The title for her talk today is Exploring the Connections Between Afrocentric Principles and Meditative Inquiry, Understanding Their Significance for Teaching and Learning in Adult Education Contexts. After Dr. Brigham, Diane Obed will be presenting. Diane Obed is mother, writer, and community member from Nunavut, Labrador, who is currently enrolled in the PhD program in Educational Studies at Mount St. Vincent University. The title for her talk today is Synergies Between Indigenous Ways of Knowing and Meditative Inquiry. Sorry, it just struck me funny that David Sable's image is up there as I'm introducing Diane. But Dr. Sable will be the third panelist. Dr. Sable is adjunct professor in the Religious Studies Department at St. Mary's University in Nova Scotia, where he has been teaching courses on Buddhism and spirituality in the workplace since 2000. The title of his talk today is Meditative Inquiry and Mindfulness. So as mentioned, we'll begin with a meditation led by Diane Sable. Diane Obed.
Thank you. Yeah. So we'll just start by taking a few moments just to settle in here and taking a comfortable position. And if it feels comfortable, I'm just going to invite you to close your eyes now. So as an anchor to this moment, just bring awareness to our breath. The breath that connects the mind and body. So take a few deep, slow inhales and exhales. If there's tension in your face, begin to soften it. Relax the forehead, the cheeks, the area of the mouth and jaw. Just let go of any tightness that might be there. See if you can breathe deeply into these areas as you exhale. And as we connect with our bodies, we'll begin to feel into the connection with the surface that's supporting our body. And then feel into how the surface is supported by the ground and the earth beneath us. Feel your feet on the ground, on the surface. Just welcome this breath. Feel and sense that the body is receiving an inhale and then releasing the exhale. A few more breaths like that. As you breathe in, internally say that you're arrived to this moment. And then as you breathe out, internally say home. Arrived, home. Just Just a few more breaths with that. So beginning to relax our attention now, we're going to invite our attention into this learning space and open to the conference. Raho, Daima, thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to be handing over now to Susan Brigham, who's going to be leading the first presentation.
Wonderful, and good afternoon. Thank you, Diane, for that lovely moment that I needed. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the organizers and all of the presenters, and of course the audience as well. It's been a very insightful and inspiring past few days. Let me just share my screen with you, please, if you don't mind. Oops, if I can. Sorry, let me figure out where I need to, which screen I need to share with you. Hang on 2 seconds. I have too many things open here, but I'm hoping this works. So let me try again. Share screen. And here we go. I hope this is going to work. Are you able to see me?
I can see your screen, but it's a Zoom phone.
Oh, yeah.
You might be on the wrong tab. If this
I'm
is
on the wrong tab. I am on the wrong tab. Let me shut down some of my tabs. That might help.
Yes,
Sorry.
yes.
This is it. This is the one.
Okay. Let me, I don't think that was the right one. Let me find the one that I look at.
Okay.
I'll get there. I really, really will. Here we go. Okay. I hope this is working.
Yeah, it's working. It's working.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody, and thanks for your patience. Let me just move things around here so I can get my screen up properly. Okay. So push my images apart. Thank you so much. And again, I appreciate the introduction. I probably don't need to say anything more because I think you gave sufficient introduction about who I am. I'll just add that, yes, I am professor here in the Faculty of Education at Mount St. Vincent University and a colleague of Dr. Ashwani Kumar. And I thank Ashwani for his work and for inviting me into his conversation around meditative inquiry. I'm going to go to the next screen. I want to share this. I'm quite sure that you recognize it, but I just want to point out that this is the Sante Maumau flag, which is also known as the Mi'kmaq Grand Council flag. And I'm sharing that just to acknowledge that I am here in Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And you may know that here in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick as well, we are governed by the treaties of peace and friendship. And so I pay respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging, and to the Mi'kmaq language and traditional knowledge. And I make this acknowledgement as a settler and not just merely as a token gesture, which I think often happens. So even as I say this land acknowledgement, I invite people to consider questions continuously about the history and the legacy of colonialism, which we are experiencing here, and how it can, I guess, lead us to question, how are settlers, how are they being privileged by this legacy of colonialism, and how can individuals develop deeper relationships with peoples whose territory that we are currently living on, and what are we collectively doing to go beyond these types of acknowledgements. I also want to acknowledge, and I'm sharing with you here, the Pan-African flag. And the Pan-African flag is one that many countries, the colors of which many countries in Africa have adopted. And it really is to represent people of African diaspora, as well as African people around the world, and to symbolize Black liberation. And I acknowledge then that here in Nova Scotia, we have a particular rich history with the folks of African descent that goes back hundreds of years. And I wanted to acknowledge that peoples of African descent were involuntarily dispersed from their homelands, and their labor has been forcibly taken and exploited for the wealth and benefit of non-African descendant peoples, and that those inequities and systemic anti-Black racism systems, they exist today and affect us all. So I'm going to go to the next screen, which I hope you can see. It's a African proverb, which says the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And I wanted to put that up front with my presentation, because I really think this is kind of the themes that I've been hearing from the presentations yesterday and today. This notion of, for example, a tool could be education. How is the education system perpetuating inequities? What can we be doing to dismantle inequities? Why do inequities keep persisting? And that's really what I do in my studies and my research and my teaching. I'm always looking for ways to understand social injustice and looking for ways to address social injustice. And as an educator, that's really one of my biggest motivations. So as someone who's taken up Afrocentricity, and I recognize Afrocentricity is understood differently by different folks. So I should say that from my understanding of Afrocentricity from the literature, I've been really, trying to make sense of Afrocentricity and how it can inform me as an educator. And then also, when I heard about meditative inquiry from Dr. Kumar, I, of course, wanted to see what were the connections and what can other ideas like meditative inquiry, what can that contribute to my already, my focus already on Afrocentricity. So I'll probably come back to this proverb again soon. But I wanted to start looking back on that chapter, which a lot of you have acknowledged was written some time ago, and we have maybe since moved beyond it or have expanded upon it. So for me, when I was focusing on this chapter, I looked at this quote by Kumar, and he says, "Our world is in crisis. Our ecology, the foundation of life on planet Earth, is in danger. Peace on Earth is also denied because of antagonistic, nationalistic, religious, ideological, radical, and economic groups." And for me, this is one of the key starting points, was trying to understand what is the role of race in this crisis that we are experiencing. So I'm just going to pull up the chapter I have is chapter 3. And so I'm just going to be referring to my chapter as I discuss. And and I also take up critical race theory a lot in my research and in my teaching. So Afrocentricity and critical race theory, to me, are radical theories that can lead to transformation and can lead to different ways of understanding different perspectives. I am, of course, some of you may know, in the field of adult education or lifelong learning. So I wanted to just give a quick definition of adult education as it pertains to my discussion. So for me, adult education is the development and enactment of knowledges and practices that make a difference to individuals, social groups, communities, and or society at large. Adult education can have a range of social, cultural, political, and economic purposes and implications. And so for me, I look at learning across the lifespan from the cradle to the grave, and I'm interested in learning that doesn't necessarily solely take place in formal context, but can be informal and can be non-formal. And I think those really actually are incredibly invaluable when we think about learning. It doesn't have to be confined to certain locations. And there's various paradigms according to Habermas, but I would say that Afrocentricity is located toward the critical as well as critical race theory. I want to share with you as I continue this quote from Hamilton, who you may know is a Nova Scotian. Her name is Sylvia Hamilton. She is a filmmaker. And this quote to me is so important, and I think it probably resonates with a lot of peoples of African descent and other marginalized and racialized folks. But she says, peoples of African descent were barely present in any meaningful way in my school books in elementary, secondary, and university levels. How does one deal with such absence, such exclusion? I sat in classes never learning about people who looked like my family, my friends, my relatives. You know you exist, your body is evident, but nothing of you exists in this wider world. And what does exist doesn't match your reality. In the rare time we were mentioned, it was a problem to be solved. She calls it a Negro problem, a colored problem, and not by us as self-directed human beings. So that again just is one of my motivations behind looking at such theories and ideas as Afrocentricity. So I talk about in my chapter the Sankofa bird. This is a symbol that you'll see right there. And it really is, as you can see, it's a symbol of a bird looking backwards and reaching backward for an egg. So there's a lot of symbolism here about looking back for wisdom, and the egg representing the next generation, and that wisdom has often been ignored, and that there is a need to look back for those previous types of wisdom. Okay, so just gonna carry on. I want to also talk about Ubuntu, and I know some folks have mentioned this already in previous presentations, and really is this idea of a theory of community, and this idea of I am because we are. So recognizing and appreciating the interconnectedness of relationships between all people, including our ancestors, so past and present. And that really is epistemologically and ontologically what is behind Afrocentricity, recognizing that relationality between us all, and also, recognizing axiologically as well that our values are relationally accountable. So again, I'm just going to go to the next slide. And one of the aspects that I speak about in this chapter is the importance of silence, and an important connection with a lot of the presenters so far and those who have written in the book, talking about when we talk about meditative inquiry and the value of silence. And I think recognizing this Swahili proverb is so critical to that important aspect of meditative inquiry, which Dr. Kumar has talked about. And yeah, I'm just going to keep going. The next point I wanted to make, which I talk about in the chapter, is the importance of embodied learning. And I think for me, Afrocentricity, self-awareness, it has to involve embracing embodied and symbolic practices that connect with the community. And that could be, for example, through song, through drumming, through dance, through libations and folk tales, and music. And so I want to share this quote if it's on there next. Yes, this quote by Rodriguez really speaks to what I'm talking about. So she says, for all of us, Black, post-colonial, and otherwise, the body represents ancestry and speaks to various processes of history. Thus, when we have to submit to ways of articulating ourselves that demand we leave our bodies out of the equation, we have profound problems. And so this connects a lot with what Ashwani Kumar talks about, while that there's a sense of alienation through various aspects. due to psychological, environmental, and psycho-environmental reasons. Understanding one's body and its function is not merely physical or medical in nature. And he goes on to say, understanding one's body and its functions means being aware of its internal as well as its external, technical, as well as creative and mundane and spiritual dimensions. And he adds that having awareness of one's body is basically a way to be at home. Body is our home, to always center, to happen at a deeper level. And it puts me in mind as when Diane gave her, led us through a meditation, she asked us to say the word home, which I really appreciate because our bodies are our sacred intelligence. And it, again, is that connection between Afrocentricity. I just wanted to quickly add that yesterday, Martin Morrison gave a presentation and talked about the Afrocentric Cohort that we had here at Mount St. Vincent University. It was a master's in education, and that all of the students and professors were of African descent, including myself. And I don't know if Martin's here, but I remember, I think it was when Martin was, we had 3 cohorts, but I remember one of the students would come to class quite regularly with her drum, and she would often drum during class or at certain moments. And then sometimes we would drum and sing. We had many folks who just sang and shared some spoken word. It was welcomed and encouraged. But I do recall at Mount St. Vincent having someone from the next class come over to us and said to us, please stop with all that noise. This is a place of learning. And, we were basically reprimanded for making noise. And to me, again, that's just a reminder of this idea of what is deemed acceptable in these places that we call learning spaces that are formalized. And often they are considered to be spaces of quiet, the places where people are, not making certain types of noise. And it's just another example of how we have assumed certain things are acceptable and certain things are not in certain spaces.
As if to illustrate a point, Dr. Brigham, this is 3 minutes.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm going to come to the end, and then I'm hoping that I can elaborate a little bit more in the discussion if we have that opportunity. But I really wanted to make this connection to Chief Seattle. This is a quote that's attributed to him in 1887. And it connects so much with Afrocentricity, with this idea of connecting with nature and spirituality. And it says, every part of the earth is sacred to my people. Every shining pine needle, every sandy shore, every mist of the dark woods, every meadow, every humming insect, all are whole in the memory and experience of my people. We know the sap that courses through the trees as we know the blood that courses through our veins. We are part of the earth, and it is part of us. And as I said, that really connects well with this notion of relationships, because we talk about relationships with those around us, but we also are thinking about relationships with our ancestors, and then recognizing relationships with the environment around us, including every little creature and every tree, etc. And so Kumar, I want to connect that with something that Dr. Kumar said, which he says, for the sake of the survival of life on the planet, as well as to have a sense of wholeness of being, that we need to educate our children and ourselves to be sensitive to the environment and the connections between the inner and the outer. So again, I think those are good points to think about when we teach, when we interact with educators and with students, that we don't necessarily have to restrict ourselves to certain environments, that it has to be a classroom with the white walls, or that it has to be a quiet space, but it can be a mix. It can be embodied learning, it can be learning that takes place outside, and it can be learning that really is respectful of the environment. So yeah, I'm going to just wrap up with this quote, this African proverb, which is, a single tree does not make a forest. And it's just a reminder about the collectivity that we are not singular in this world, that we are a part of a community, we are part of a collective, and that's, to me, where our power comes from, is recognizing our connectivity to others, and then finding ways to maybe embody this idea in classrooms, in the way that we teach, in the way that we learn, because that is speaking to this notion of cooperation, working together, this idea of companionship, that we are coming together as intentionally, and that we can be in relation, maybe even in friendship with each other. And it reflects to this idea of compassion and communion, which is moments of when we let go our preconceived ideas about each other and communicate openly and as authentically as we can. So I think my time is up. I'm just sharing this last screen with some of the articles that I referred to on Afrocentric education. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brigham. And we'll bring everyone back together at the end. But right now, I'm going to introduce Diane Obed, who's next to speak.
Thank you, Susan. That was beautiful. I still haven't figured out the share screen, and luckily I think that's okay because I didn't spend a lot of time with the slides. They were mainly just images, and that's okay that they're not here. So yeah, thank you, Ashwani, and to the organizing team for having me at this conference and allowing me to share some of my own work in amongst this really great community of scholars on meditative inquiry. As was mentioned and as I was introduced, I am an Inuit doctoral student working with Ashwani Kumar, who is my supervisor. And for those that aren't familiar about who Inuit are, maybe we are one of 3 Indigenous peoples in Canada, and we are Indigenous to the circumpolar Arctic. So we inhabit the global north. And so while I grew up in the north, I'm currently living in a place called Wahamiak, which is the traditional name for this region, which means where the fresh water flows, near the Sabaganagati River in Nova Scotia. Yeah, one of the slides I had a beautiful land acknowledgement, and it's really what I'm doing with meditative inquiry in my doctoral work is exploring how it can be drawn upon for looking at decolonizing environmental education broadly. And more specifically, I'm exploring notions of indigeneity, ecology, land education, and meditative inquiry to support that decolonization on a deepened level for people. And what that means in many ways is I'm exploring that, and I'll share some of that in today's talk. But yeah, so coming back to the land acknowledgement, my story with meditative inquiry begins here in Mi'kma'ki. And part of my contemplative work is to explore more deeply what actually a land acknowledgement means, right? So where that fire took place, my chapter begins with the story of a sacred ceremonial fire, where I'm situated, as Susan mentioned, and many others mentioned in the conference this past couple of days, which is really great, that we're on the unceded ancestral lands of the Peace and Friendship Treaty signed by early newcomers and the Ulnu, the Mi'kmaq, who are recognized as sovereign people and sovereign nations on their territories. And so they have exercised their right to their nations, to their territories, by signing these binding agreements called treaties. And those treaties really were with the intention to share the land and to coexist peacefully, hence the name of the treaty, Peace and Friendship Treaty. And in connection with that, it was to maintain the integrity and the wellness, the well-being of the land, because that is a core worldview and ethic and value, is to maintain the well-being of all life forms. So the Mi'kmaq people here, who are the first people, have stewarded these lands for tens of thousands of years prior to the newcomers arriving some 400 or 500 years ago. And so they have flourished these lands so that we can enjoy them now in Canada as part of our own well-being. And so I learn a lot from the Mi'kmaq people as a person who's also a newcomer to this area. And it's a very important part of my exploration of meditative inquiry and Indigenous ways of knowing, is learning from how they live their responsibilities to care for the land. And so just the comment, about how do we go, and this is really kind of core into how I draw on meditative inquiry in decolonization, is to think about, not only think about, but to contemplate on how we can go beyond acknowledging the land, to thanking them, to acknowledging the local human ancestors for keeping the earth healthy, and to have meaningful relationships with the Mi'kmaq and the Indigenous people here, who continue to stand on the front lines to protect the local rivers, waters, and many other life forms, so that we may all be well. Okay, so this is a huge contribution that the Mi'kmaq people, I live about 100 meters away from the Saba-Ganagadi River. And so before even, I came across meditative inquiry, I was engaging in meditative practices on the land as part of my formal study, both formal and informal. Is to be in practice and ceremony. And so, yeah, I appreciate the land acknowledgements. And I think that, one of the opportunities that we have with meditative inquiry is we can welcome further dialogue about how we can deepen our understanding of what the land acknowledgement means and how we can live in ways that go beyond acknowledging, so that we can honor the first peoples in ways that are meaningful for them in their self-determination. And so again, so I'm a slow talker. I know that I'm going to probably not cover all of the things that I have prepared for today, but one of my main interests in my doctoral work is exploring the processes and approaches that allow us to go beyond sort of the conceptual, intellectual, performative thinking, rational aspects, because we see this a lot in allyship, of talking, but how do we actually align our values with our habits and behaviors in our bodies so that we're integrated? And this is really important to me because as an Indigenous person and as Indigenous peoples, we're dealing with, consistent, routine sort of federal apologies, right, in the dominant discourse. Over the past several years. And we've even had the recent visit of Pope Francis, the Catholic Pope, come to Canada and provide an apology. And this is very healing and meaningful for me and for others who are survivors of the residential school system. But what I'm really curious about is what it actually means for us to integrate new patterns of relating and behaving and habits, so that we are really enacting our equity, so that we're walking our talk. And so I see meditative inquiry as assisting in filling this gap that supports us to be, as Susan mentioned, a core ethic in Indigenous and in Afrocentric worldviews is embodiment, and to be congruent. So I'm just gonna jumped ahead a little bit there. So Yeah, in my short time, I'm just going to reflect on the commonalities and synergies between the work of meditative inquiry, and which is based on the teachings and wisdom of Jiddu Krishnamurti, and explore how these Eastern perspectives aligns with Indigenous ways of knowing here in North America. And so what I've heard over the past day and a half, there have been so many beautiful connections. Susan, I really appreciate the segue that you made with Chief Seattle. I was getting emotional, actually, because I have a quote from Chief Seattle as well. But so some of those themes that I've been hearing that really resonate with me are learning from nature, learning to become ecologically embedded in ways that are respectful and honoring, reconciliatory, and reparatory. Some other themes are acknowledging and working with the pain of racial violence, of colonialism, and working through that, working with those feelings, not seeing them as, not dismissing them as hindrances to the learning process. But for me, I'm an emotional learner, so I've come to learn understand from an Indigenous elder that sensitivity is a gift, whereas all of my previous conditioning and social messaging was that it's an impediment to my learning. But I actually was able to reframe that, and meditative inquiry allows me to work with emotions as a form of intelligence into our learning. Just taking a pause here for a moment. It's coming back into my body. So, yeah, so some of the main concepts in my chapter that I take up with meditative inquiry is story, metaphor, emotionality, and embodiment. And that's the holistic approach of indigeneity as well. That really echoes that. And so I often focus in my work on the subjective experience of learning, of the inner experience. And so, as I mentioned, I've been feeling emotions during the conference, even just sitting and being in practice while here. I actually shed a few tears at the opening meditation yesterday morning. So being an emotional learner can be challenging. However, as I mentioned, it allows me to translate into words the richness that is communicated to me, to my mind from my body. And so I had a slide of an image that I wanted us to reflect on, but in your own mind's eye for a moment, I'd like you to picture the metaphor of an iceberg in your mind. And the iceberg, the picture is just, it has a large piece underwater, has a water line, and then it has a small piece on the surface above the water line. So just in your mind's eye, just bring your awareness to that image for a moment. The floating iceberg. And what comes to mind when you think of this image and when you visualize this in your mind? If you feel comfortable sharing in chat, feel free to share. What comes to mind when you think of the image of an iceberg?
I just opened the chat.
Thank you. So for me, this is one of my favorite metaphors as a person from the Arctic. It touches some deep primal part within me. And the metaphor can mean many, many things, right? What is the meaning that we bring to these metaphors is sort of an Indigenous teaching of allowing a person to make their own meaning from story and from metaphor. And so for me, what it represents is sort of a split, the Western Cartesian mind-body split that has that emphasis on intellect, right? And so what meditative inquiry and I think Indigenous wisdom offers is allowing the full self to be present, to lower that waterline so that more of us can be present, and bring us into the body. Depth versus surface, hidden truths, realities, so much lies beneath. Beautiful, I'm getting chills reading this. Yeah, so here's what really I'd like to send home with the metaphor for me, is that if we're only asking ourselves to learn on conceptual levels, we are missing 2/3 of our learning, right? So when I think about emotionality on a physiological level, the layer of embodiment is really key to unlearning habits that we have inherited over generations through things like colonization. Colonization becomes embedded in our bodies as habits, as unconscious behaviors. And I love the previous presentation, Regine, and the question was about, what about the conscious and unconscious? I really, really appreciate that, because in my experience, in working with well-intended folks who teach about cultural safety, who teach about just safety, sometimes there's this dissonance. And as I mentioned, this gap in the way that they're trained, and I see it as a byproduct of the system. It's not personal. Meditative inquiry has granted me the permission to really hold compassion. And Ashwani has taught me a lot about compassion. I could get emotional about that, because that teaching is huge. But so we see a lot of performative allyship, right? Rather than relating in authentic ways and being in our bodies. And so embodiment is a layer of sensation and feeling that takes practice to be with and identify those sensations. And meditative inquiry brings us into our bodies. The first time I sat in session with Ashwani, I met him in 2020. He offered his presentation and did the practice. Immediately, I came into my body and I felt this visceral, palpable sense of being in the present and coming here now out of the mind. And so the
3 minutes.
The synergy, the synergy between Indigenous ways of knowing and meditative inquiry is emphasis on practice. Practice, repetition, ritual, so that we can become integrated, so that we can become congruent and aligned with what we aspire to enact in terms of anti-oppression and liberation and emancipatory, in terms of the earth as well. I had a whole section on emotions, but I'm going to skip that and just make reference to the story of the fire. The story of the fire, you know, as human beings prior to colonization, we're all colonized, by the way. We used to sit around fires and tell stories and have a sense of social connection that way through it, and have that sense of belonging with one another. And so the connection here with meditative inquiry is that this is kind of a ceremonial aspect of coming into relation to one another through things like fire, the basic elements of life, and tapping into different states of consciousness, which can be invoked through meditative inquiry. And so sacred fire is really important as a metaphor for Indigenous worldviews in terms of rekindling our own inner fire. That's how I interpret the metaphor and the meaning for me of that fire, rekindling and making space for my heart to be present, for my spirit to be present. And recognizing that that all things possess soul, that we have animistic worldviews. And so both of these worldviews attempt to bring in the deep parts, the layered parts of that iceberg back into our learning. And so I'm really looking forward to continued conversation and discussion. There's so much more that I have to share. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane, for those words. Honestly, I feel like I'm the system. I come in and say 3-minute warning to everybody just as they're getting speaking of these anti-systemic things and structures. Oh my gosh. However, here we are. So David Sable, it's over to you now.
All right, so I want to thank in particular Diane and Susan for their presentations, and to say that it's an honor to be in the presentation on diverse cultural perspectives and meditative inquiry, as what at least most people would say is, you know, this old white man here. So I must say, I did start by asking Ashwani, it's fine, but why would I be in that group? And he just said, that's just the way that it worked out. So I'm very happy to do this. My life has been like this. And I've tried to create a short little presentation that fits with the idea of diverse cultural perspectives. And one that didn't make it into the short slideshow is the work of my wife, who wrote this book with Bernie Francis, one of the Mi'kmaq people who is a linguist and who I got to know amongst many other First Nations people. And that has been an important influence on me. And maybe that will come through in the course of the presentation. One of the things that Bernie pointed out to me, and that my wife Trudy emphasizes again and again, is that when people say, well, how should we regard you? What do you want? What do you need? And Bernie would just say, well, we just want to be regarded as people, not as oppressed people, and not as a marginalized people. We just want to be regarded as people. And so I took my cue and continue to take my cue from that. And what it does is it brings me to the point of saying, okay, how can I just be authentic here? And to me, that has been the basis for the most wonderful conversations with people that my wife Trudy brought into my life. So in a way, she should be here. She'll be at the cultural event with me on Thursday night, but I want to honor her too for introducing me to the importance of working with the First Nations and the Indigenous people here in Canada. So, all right, I'm going to quickly go through some of this, but like Diane, I'm kind of a slow talker, and we'll probably not get too far quickly. So let's see if I can find my presentation here. Okay, so oops. Okay, so you should be able to see this. Starting right in, there's no lead-in slide. You'll have to excuse the lack of a formal presentation. One of the major influences on me was my experience at Columbia University.
Dr.
I
Sable,
graduated-
can I just ask you, at the bottom of your screen, of your slideshow, you'll see a slide, and it's slideshow, and if you click it, then all we'll see is your slide. We can currently see all of your slides.
Hmm.
Do you see what I mean? On the bottom, it says notes, and then there's a square, and then there's 4 squares, and then there's a book, and then there's a slide projector.
Yeah, no, this,
No?
it's giving, I'm on a split screen. And
Oh,
I
okay, okay,
can't
never
see-
mind, this is fine.
Let's just see here. I can, that's right. Let's just. Yeah, it's because I'm on a split screen here myself, so.
Okay,
we're
this
just
is
gonna
fine,
have to-
yeah.
I think we're just gonna work with this. So, major influences that created an appreciation for diversity. The first one is that I went to Columbia University. And I graduated a long time ago in 1968. That was the year that Columbia was in a revolution. Students took over the university. They were incensed by the establishment. There were 2 major reasons for this. One of them was racism. The other one was the war, what we called the Vietnam War, which the Vietnamese called the American War, that war. And what you see here is a building that was taken over by students in protest. We really thought at that time that the world as we knew it was coming apart. We really thought that the establishment was about to collapse, that nothing would be as it had gone on since the beginning of racism and wars, and we were entering a new era, and we were going to be the forefront of that. So there was a kind of strange optimism about the future. At the same time, there was a fierce pride, arrogance, and ignorance about what was really about to happen in the next 50, 60 years. So you could say that I have behind me a long experience of people who just want to condemn and criticize capitalism, colonialism, all of it. And it still persists. Like the metaphor of the iceberg that Diane used, 4/5 of it is under the surface. How do you change what's under the surface? So I spent the next 17 years or more, actually, going back and forth between New York, where I grew up, and northern Vermont at a meditation center called Karma Choling, and where I could say that I made my own relationship to living on the land, actually not in a cabin as you see in the lower right hand of the screen, but in a tent on the land, alone in the woods for the first time, without any other contact with people, except to come down before dawn to get food. And so that experience was a major influence on me. And when I think about how I grew up, how I became an adult, it was here. It was on the land. It was connected to an environment where when I woke up in the morning and looked outside and had to desperately get outside to pee, there was a snake coiled in front of me in a little circle of sunlight that had just come through the trees. And where I went through a lot of fear about leaving the tent, except that I really had to go. And so I learned a lot by being on the land, not just about the beauty, not just about the ecological harmony of what was there, but why it is we have a built world. And what were human beings trying to do when they built houses, when they created cities? So both of those aspects became part of my relationship to the land. And that was a major influence on me to this day. And I just wanted to know what I should do. So my teacher was a Tibetan Buddhist. And he told me very little in the beginning. He said, just sit. I said, but what about all these techniques? What about following my breath and this and that? And he said, just sit. He really wasn't going to entertain my intellectual proclivity. And when you compare that with what Ashwani Kumar describes as meditative inquiry, an existential approach in experiencing and observing one's thoughts, emotions, actions, and so forth, one learns to be with one's thoughts, feelings, and experiences as they are, rather than suppressing them. I see and feel a lot of resonance. And so my chapter is about the connection, the underlying similarity, and some recognition of what more meditative inquiry tries to do. So from my point of view, the problem is not capitalism. The problem is something deeper than that. And what we see in the university world is simply an expression of various kinds of materialism, mental fixations, and particularly those that are beneath the water level in the iceberg. And we know about materialism, everybody talks about it these days, the accumulation of wealth, possessions, and status. But I mean it as psychological materialism, any dogmatic adherence to ideology. And in the wider social environment, even adherence to spiritual practices that are being used to escape from our world and bypass the human condition. So the fundamental challenge is recognizing the whole iceberg. And if we need to name that, we're not going to encompass it completely or properly by labeling it as war or environmental issues or racism. It's going to be both the individual and the collective fixations, the shared fixations, the way in which these icebergs are somehow in relation to each other. And what are we going to do about that? Am I painting a bleak picture? I don't mean to, because I do think that mindfulness and meditative inquiry are one way to make a better world. Like meditative inquiry, mindfulness can allow students to be in a liminal space. That means not having an answer or response. That means resting the mind with a question, holding complex or even existential questions open. Something transformative emerges then. And here's a quote from probably the most influential person in the mindfulness movement, Jon Kabat-Zinn. Mindfulness is not a catechism, an ideology, a belief system, a technique or set of techniques, a religion or a philosophy. It is best described as a way of being. And so that, combined with the fact that I come from an intellectual background, that I come from lower middle class Jewish people in New York and ancestors behind them who started in slavery. That is the influence that brings me to meditative inquiry. And you'll notice it's both individual and collective. And I don't identify just with the collective. I need to bring together the apparent reality, the emotionality of having individuality and being part of a collective at the same time. So techniques are not the point. And the message you learn from life experience in the end cannot be dependent on the instructor or the instructor. Just be. And so it depends to some extent on the instructor's relationship with students, because in order to convey what it is that an authentic teacher has to convey, there has to be trust and openness on both sides, even love, to let go of our conditioned expectations, both for students and for teachers. And this is common ground with meditative inquiry. That is supposed to be a hidden slide that's coming up. So we're going to skip through this and the next one, and I'm going to move right to this one. Because what I want to be able to do is what I do with my own students. I don't talk for too long. I immediately want to engage them in a process. And it has an introspective section and an interactive section.
It's a 3-minute warning.
Perfect. What I want to do is lead you through a very quick exercise. Then you can fill it in chat, and we can also have conversations about it that should be able to relate back to the other presentations as well. So I'm going to ask you a simple question. What does this picture mean to you? Take a good look at it, but do not answer. Even in your own mind, if you can suspend our automatic habits to immediately start describing our response. Just look openly, without judgment, observing what you see for a moment in silence. And to make this work on time, I'm going to shorten that and take you to the second part of introspection, which is pay attention to the underlying felt sense. This means being mindful of what's beneath the surface, the water level, the iceberg underneath. Notice what feeling comes that may not yet be articulated. Notice your response, not with words and concepts, but what's not yet formed in words. Notice it somewhere between your bottom and your neck, in your body, directly, before you have words for it. And what I'm going to ask you then is to formulate a response that takes into account the felt sense. And what I do with students is I have them do this part and then write something down. The act of writing changes our experience. I can't go into that in depth, but it matters that people try to put the felt sense in words. The interactive part of this does not involve me. It's getting people to work in pairs and to ask each other authentic, genuine questions that are not an attack, but a way to open dialogue. So there's more about this in my chapter. And what I'm going to ask you to do in whatever time is left in my little presentation here is just to pay attention to that felt sense. And then if you can, put something in the chat so that we can share the diversity and the commonality of our experiences. Okay. I think we can leave it at that and go back to the group and see what comes.
Okay,
What
thank you.
comes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sable. There were some responses to your request. I don't know if you have your chat open yet, but everyone, the chat is open now. What I'm going to do next is bring everybody back into the conversation.
Right.
So I will ask the other presenters to please turn your cameras on so we can spotlight you. Marvelous. Okay, Susie's here. Great. Okay, and I'll just let you know, we have 10 minutes for discussion. So maybe you can all, begin by making comment on, any comments you have about each other's work, or perhaps start from where Dr. Sable left off there, just asking for comment.
I just love the synergy between the three. They just all really complement one another really well with the felt sense and with the commonalities across cultures.
Yes, I agree, Diane. I saw a lot of connectivity through all three of us. And in your chapter, I was just observing something, which there was a question in the chat box that made me think about vulnerabilities. And I just wanted to highlight something you said in your chapter, which I think is so important for us to remember. And it says, you say, as an Indigenous woman scholar, I have often felt these major cultural rifts and alienation within academia, leaving me feeling disassociated and uneasy about expressing my deepest learnings from Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers. And this is in part due to this incommensurability of worldviews, where Eurocentric formal education is designed to enable economic participation, and Indigenous knowledge is about, regeneration for future generations. And that you mentioned how you feel vulnerable because it, expressing or sharing because of the institution, in a sense that you almost feel like this is by sharing, it's like a sense of colonial voyeurism or the colonial gaze. And so there is that sense of vulnerability. I think that marginalized folks, including peoples of African descent, Indigenous folks, there doesn't seem to be a space, and there's a caution. Sorry, I might have just gone a little bit off topic, but I was just looking at a question that Martin Morrison put in the chat, and it was making me think about that vulnerability. So yeah, I took us in a different direction. So let me stop and see if David had something to add.
But I do want to share that question in case everyone hasn't seen it. What thoughts do you have about integrating this centering that Afrocentricity, Indigenous knowledge, and meditative inquiry can afford through the validation and affirmation of the whole self and its divergence from Eurocentric and colonial institutions, cultural values, belief systems, and actions that make vulnerable or harm us, including emotions, communalism, expression of celebration, and connectivity? That's the question Susie was referring to. I just wanted to make sure everyone could see that.
Yeah, well, to follow on that and to respond to what's just been brought up, it is out of shared vulnerability that we might come to trust each other in the present moment. So what I find with my students is if I can bring them into the present moment, and not only do they listen to each other better in pairs than in the whole group, but they open up to each other in such a way that they are vulnerable, whether they are from Asia, New York, Halifax, they can do that. And when they share that vulnerability, then something new emerges and you have the potential for real dialogue. At that point, the meaning that emerges between them is something new. It's actually something created between the two people in the moment. And so the vulnerability that you're talking about, to me, that's direction that says, okay, if I'm going to be able to direct a class, whether I'm just facilitating or teaching, literally, I'm going to have to be authentic, vulnerable, open. And that might enable someone to feel that they can share their side.
Is there anything you'd like to share about that, Diane?
I think the question may have been asked to Susie, so I think I'd like to create space for Susie to respond if she wanted.
Oh, thanks, Diane. Yeah, I'm not completely clear on the question, but I feel like the question is about how can we integrate Afrocentricity and Indigenous knowledge and meditative inquiry so that it helps us to validate and affirm the whole self, and recognizing how these systems have made us vulnerable and may harm us. I think that's just rewording how I think the question goes, but it made me think of, I gave a presentation to Ashwani's class, and I remember one of the students had asked that, would this be cultural appropriation if he as a white teacher used Afrocentric ideas in the classroom? And to me, it was like, this is knowledge, this is legitimate. Why would you think that it's got nothing to do with you and that you couldn't make use of it or understand it for your own critical lens that you could apply on what you do as a teacher? And it made me think that often a lot of us who are racialized or marginalized, we are asked all the time to take on perspectives that are not resonating with us and don't speak about us. They don't really seem to have anything much to do with us and our lives and our stories and our histories. And so we are asked consistently to make use of other, I'm going to use the word Eurocentric for lack of a better category. So I guess my point is there is a value in Afrocentricity, there is a value in meditative inquiry and Indigenous knowledges, as you say, Martin, and that they should be recognized and acknowledged so that they can validate these various isms that we continually bump up against and get in the way of our learning and our way of moving toward a more socially just society, because as it is, we know there's a problem. There's lots of problems in the society, and we keep saying, well, we're working at it. We're just be patient with us. No. We've been waiting in hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, we've been working too. It's not like we've been passively sitting around. So I may not have answered your question, but I just wanted to say that yes, these ideas and other ideas that will come along can be useful for those very points that you made about challenging Eurocentricity.
That's a great point, Susie. If I can just add a quick thought to that. You know, often a lot of the people either just reject other worldviews or different worldviews, or even if they see value in it, especially the majority people or the white people, they begin to think that it's cultural appropriation. Then I think there is like catch 2020, you can get out of it, right? I think it's very important to recognize. That's what I try to share with my students, especially social studies students, that it is our responsibility to learn about other cultures, their philosophies, their values, and integrate into our teaching, but not in a way of exploiting it or misrepresenting it. But if you are not open to learn about other things, how can we make how can we ensure that diverse worldviews are accepted and discussed, and students see that their teacher looks at things from a variety of perspective rather than from one particular perspective. So I totally agree with you. It is their responsibility to learn about these knowledge systems and include them into their teaching and learning. Thank you.
Okay, that brings us to the end of the session then. So it's break time, everyone. Thank you so much, all three of you, for all of your thoughtful comments and responding to questions. I will apologize there, Susie. I thought you had already addressed that question, which is why I was asking Diane if she wanted to comment. I apologize for that, and I appreciate your answer. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now so everyone can see. We'll have a